Thank you. And thanks to USC for organizing this conference. Truly, it required vision and presence of mind to put this together. So I thank you for that. Yes, I'm here to explore certain aspects of homeland diaspora relations, focusing on charitable assistance from diaspora to Armenia and how that has evolved or how it has cut a serpentine path over the last 25 years, moving from, I would say, immediate emergency aid, lurching forward towards something more developmental or rehabilitative assistance today. I'll be painting a picture with a broad brush, so of course I invite you later to clarify the discussion through your questions. As Ron Sunni pointed out yesterday, 25 years is a good marker, but it's not exact. If we want to look at the development of charitable assistance toward Armenia from the diaspora, really you have to go back to the late 1980s. I would say 29, 30 years. What had been a tightly regulated, closed relationship between homeland and diaspora through official structures opened up quite abruptly through the turmoil that came about in 1988, first through the Karabakh movement and later, 6 months later, through the earthquake of December 1988. Those two events, in a sense, tore asunder the fabric of homeland diaspora relations as they had been and created a rough and tumble environment that became more open, more diverse, and ultimately, I think, more fruitful. Let's talk a little bit about those years in the late Soviet era. I don't want to give you a history lesson, but briefly, as you'll recall, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh petitioned for the right to self-determination, seeking to secede from Soviet Azerbaijan and to unify with Soviet Armenia. Within perhaps a month or two of their public efforts, the Armenians, starting in Yerevan, responded with massive solidarity efforts, with public rallies, demonstrations that grew to nearly 1 million in size by the end of February 1988. It was really a tremendous moment in time for those who watched it either here or from afar, could see the limits of glasnost being tested. Armenians taking Gorbachev at his word and saying, if you mean what you say with openness and restructuring, then let's fill in the blank pages of history and restore sovereignty to Karabakh. At the time, the Armenian diaspora watched largely from afar. There was a smattering of diasporan Armenians here, either as exchange scholars, journalists, or other visitors. But for the most part, our organized diaspora watched closely from afar. And we have to remind ourselves of the political consciousness of the Armenian diaspora, if we can characterize it as a political consciousness, due to the conditions of the formation of our diaspora, largely created due to genocide, growing up with an exile consciousness, and often a feeling of alienation toward Soviet Armenia, there was a thirst or a hunger to engage with Armenia in a more substantial way, to actually get involved in the affairs of society. And Armenians from diaspora looked very closely, hoping for that day when they would have that opportunity. Well, that day came very quickly, because shortly after the 1 million person rallies here in downtown Yerevan, Azerbaijani mobs responded with brutal pogroms in Sumgait, killing dozens of Armenians, driving out many others. And soon, Karabakh was in a state of siege that within a few years unfolded into all-out war and created really a state of emergency within Azerbaijan, Armenia, and of course, Karabakh itself. Within that environment, Armenians got to work. Diasporan Armenians began protesting outside of Soviet embassies, meeting with human rights organizations, raising money to help Karabakh Armenians defend themselves. So there was a flurry of activity, but it didn't involve really entering Armenia until later that year when the earthquake struck. The earthquake was of enormous proportions, physically, but also in terms of the human toll. And frankly, Armenia's authorities were not prepared for it, nor were Soviet Central authorities prepared for it. It was really beyond their means to address the emergency effectively. So to their credit, Soviet authorities actually opened up the gates a little bit. And they allowed many outside groups, international groups like AmeriCares and the Red Cross, but also diaspora and Armenian groups to enter in order to tender emergency assistance. And that, I think, was the first real exposure in the late 80s of large numbers of diasporan Armenians. Now, when I say large numbers, maybe in the hundreds or the few thousands, nurse practitioners, psychiatrists, architects, builders, emergency response teams, and many others, often Armenian, would come to address those who had been hit by the earthquake. Now, at the time, I think the mindset of the diaspora was give early, give often, and don't ask a lot of questions. Okay? In fact, I think the diaspora at the time was hardwired to give because, in a way, the need was there. The need was immediate and pressing, but the diaspora also gave because it felt good to give. And I don't mean to demean the assistance tendered in any way, but the act of giving was as important as the end result itself, because the diaspora largely had been denied any meaningful interaction for so many years. Now, I think another reason why diaspora and assistance groups or relief groups did not engage in long-term planning. It was all about immediate assistance. There were no measurements, there were no metrics, there were no long-term goals. It was all about helping now. I think part of the reason also was that Armenia at the time was still firmly ensconced within the Soviet contours of power. Nobody could imagine that 3 years later the Soviet Union was going to collapse. I think the diaspora at the time thought, we're going to go in, we're going to help, we're going to engage with Armenia, and Armenia will continue down its path, and the Soviet Union will continue down its path. I think no one really could imagine that by 1991, Armenia would be independent with all of the possibilities and especially pitfalls associated with independence. Now, the mentality of short-term emergency assistance carried over. If we thought it was a one-off at the time, it soon became an ingrained habit. It turned into an ongoing pattern. Those of you who recall, as Don Miller mentioned, Armenia's early years of independence are often called the years of cold and darkness. Massive economic dislocations, blockade by Azerbaijan to the east, Turkey to the west, created an Armenia that was struggling to survive, in which every day was an act of improvisation. In that sort of environment, the Armenian diaspora again came together. Many leading organizations came together to organize what we call Operation Winter Rescue, gathering large numbers of blankets, warm clothing, foodstuffs, medicines, anything that could be required to make it through the long, hard winters that extended into the mid-90s and beyond. So if you look, even into the years of independence, the diaspora, in a sense, became trained. If it wasn't already hardwired, it became hardwired into thinking about assistance as an emergency affair, in which you don't ask a lot of questions, just get to it. I'm happy to say that haltingly, lurchingly, that relationship has begun to change. And I think there are various reasons for it. I can't point to all of them now. But one I can point to is the development of government-led developmental assistance beginning in the mid-90s with the Hayastan All Armenia Fund, the Հիմնադրամ. With all of its flaws, with all of its ills, the Hayastan Հիմնադրամ established a model for large-scale strategic development projects that the entire diaspora could embrace. And one of the first large projects they took on was building the Lachin Corridor Road that connects Karabakh to Armenia and creates contiguity between Karabakh and Armenia. So on the one hand, I think the development of the Հիմնադրամ was one of those focal points that began to train our attention on long-term development. But there were also inadvertent side effects of Հիմնադրամ. It wasn't all like, we're doing great strategic development projects, come along. Some of it was inadvertent. I think as Armenia moved into the 1990s, the legitimacy that authorities enjoyed at the beginning began to erode. If Armenians were happily on the road to independence in '89 and happily casting a yes vote in 1991, by 1995, 96, they were storming the barricades when incumbent Levon Ter-Bedrosian ran for election against Vasken Manoukian. In many ways, government authority had eroded, legitimacy had eroded, and this carried over into the realm of humanitarian assistance. I think more and more people were not willing to ignore issues of corruption. Where's my money going? How is my money being spent? Others were no longer willing to ignore issues of dependency. That is, if we continue to hand things out, are we going to create a culture of handouts where people, instead of helping themselves, expect us to continue to help them in perpetuity? These questions began to be asked more insistently beginning in the mid-90s and thereafter. And what was the reaction? I think probably a three-pronged response. I think some of the traditional diaspora, the classical diasporan organizations, continued doing what they were doing. There were donors, particularly large donors, who got burned, who made deals with ministers only to find out that they had been fleeced, who became disenchanted and pulled back. And then there were those who went the other direction, became more intent on forging ahead and establishing their own mechanisms. Different philanthropists got tired of writing checks. My own boss, for example, he got tired of writing checks. He established his own foundation, began hiring his own staff, and began to bring about international best practices into his organization in Armenia. So over time, I think, we have seen a move more in that direction. And again, it's not a complete move, it's a lurching, incomplete move. But what you see as a result is a broader engagement today with Armenia. It's no longer about sponsoring immediate needs. It's not about soup kitchens and orphanages anymore. It's also about aiding civil society groups, aiding those who wish to establish themselves business-wise or otherwise in Armenia. Let me quickly try to wrap up and say this, that something else is going on that I can only give a minute to, which is that social change in Armenia has been ongoing while all of this has been happening. I believe that after the flurry of democracy in the late 80s, early 90s, Armenia retrenched. Many of the citizenry went back into a state of passivity, inertia, cynicism, often looking up at the authorities as the source of all ill or the source of all possible remedy, which was a convenient excuse to do nothing. The idea of grassroots activism or of social movements in the Western style really had not hit the ground by the 1990s or even the early 2000s. I would say it's the last 10 years, I can't pinpoint exactly when, where there has been a creeping move towards a different kind of ethos, the formation of a real civil society, people from below organizing around issues of environment, public space, consumer rights, gender inequality, and other issues. Slowly, you're starting to see different groups emerging in civil society that are seeking concessions from authority. They're not looking necessarily for all or nothing solutions, but whether it's the move to protect Terut, the demonstrations for Mashtot's Park, the rallies for electric Yerevan, the 100 Drum movement, people have begun to organize for change from below. This presents a great opportunity for the diaspora because I believe the diaspora has an opportunity to cross that thick red line from humanitarian assistance into something else, which I would call engagement or solidarity or exchange. Something more lateral, something where we're not here to help Armenia, we're here to be Armenia, to engage with Armenia and make something out of the diaspora-homeland relationship that wasn't there before. So let me stop there. Thank you, Don, and thank you for your patience.